And so we have been inviting authors in over the last 8 or 9 months to come in and speak to us about what it looks like to seek wisdom in the places that we work. And normally our lunch and learns, we have a lot of business workers from town come and we do panels and let them talk about their experience. This series has been a little bit different. Instead of that, we've invited authors who take the time to write on different topics of faith and ask them to contextualize that to their work. So this is a really special one in that our author, Dr. Uli Chi, who you'll hear from in a minute, we have a book. Every one of you can leave with a copy of this book that he's brought. That the Fuller Seminary, the pre-leadership seminar, Fuller Seminary is sponsored for you all to have the book that Dr. Chi's out. So you get a chance to take that book with you. We chose the series title "Wisdom: Seeking Wisdom in the Workplace" because a lot of the conversations that I end up having are with people who are navigating decisions. They're navigating: am I in the right career? What should I do in the job? What direction should I go? They're making decisions every single day that they're wondering how their faith can inform or how it affects what they're doing. And so we wanted to take a year to really wrestle with this word wisdom. And if you've engaged this series at all, like me, you have realized how squishy of a word wisdom is. Trying to come up with a one definition for wisdom is a really hard thing to do. It's not fully knowledge acquisition, but it kind of is. It's being a community, but not fully that. It's something to other things. It's reading your Bible, but more than that. And it's this thing it encompasses all of who we are. And so we've been trying to wrestle together about what it means to seek wisdom in our daily, mundane, everyday lives. And so whether this is your first time coming on these, or this is your bet out of the 6 events, we're so glad you're here to wrestle anew along this topic with us, as Dr. Chi really serves as a guide for us to continue to think about what it means to seek wisdom in all parts of our lives. I am so thankful that Dr. Uli Chi is here. Our paths crossed for the first time a few years ago at a retreat we both were out in Texas, and immediately was struck before I knew him that this is someone that I wanted to have kind of deal with. Came across as someone that I knew had a lot of the word we're using today, wisdom to offer. And so when it became available that we could have him come to town, I jumped on the opportunity. And it's like the Lord's timing that he could come during the series that we're doing on wisdom. Last year he released a book that's on your table, The Wise Leader. And it's a wonderful, beautiful book. And it's the first thing to tell you that the book doesn't give you one definition for wisdom. It walks you through what it looks like to embody wisdom in the places God has you to be. And so as he comes to share some insights from the book, I would love for you as he's talking to begin. This is not just putting information in your brain, but he's inviting you into this journey of wisdom, where after he's done talking, you'll have time, and I've been told to change from saying Q&A to a question and response time, which I think is a more wise way of thinking about it. But we'll have a chance for you to dialogue back. So keep it as he's talking, as things kind of are bubbling up. We want to provide space for you to engage with Dr. Chi. He'll be able to hang around too after. Some of you will have a hard stop with one, have to go, but if you can leave here, he'll be here too to talk. But we are so thankful to have you be a part of this conversation. And whenever you can show up to some of ours. This is meant to be not just getting Alice, but a gift to you, your equal of your day. Each of you are coming from different things that have happened today. Some of you are coming from a hard work situation. We've been thinking through things. Some of you are feeling really joyful about how things are going at work. Some of you are leaving here to go really hard meeting. Or maybe this is the last thing you have for the day, so you're really excited to go home. All of you are coming from different spaces and the different headspaces, but we get, as a body of Christ, as people who at some level want to follow Jesus in the places he calls us, get to do that together today. So different businesses and churches, industries, ages, a few ladies are here, thank you for that, that we come together for this idea to think together on these topics of this. So without further ado, I'm so thankful to have Dr. Chi. Please help me welcome you here.
Thanks, buddy. All right. So can you hear me all right? Is the mic? You can hear me? Is that right? Is the mic not on? It was on before, right? I get a little closer to it. Oh. Do you need me to get, is this better? Yeah. Okay, maybe I need to do this. How's that? That's even better, right? My wife always claims I drop my voice and no one can hear me. So Clay, if you're in the back, if you can't hear anything, just raise your hand and I'll try and talk a little closer, even closer to the mic, right? So I just want to acknowledge my friend Rob Semke, who's in the back right next to the photography or the video recording equipment. Rob is a very, I was going to say a very old friend, but that's probably true in both senses, that we're both old people, but we've known each other for 50-some years. If you read the book, I talk about he and his wife. We became good friends when we were still in college, and we were at the same church, and so I call him one of our best friends. And Rob has offered to be my driver he lives in Nashville, he and his wife, Lori, and he drove me here and is driving me back. So that gives me a chance to focus just on what I need to focus on rather than worrying about not driving off the end of the road or something. So, but it reminded me, I'm a big fan. When I was younger, I loved science and mathematics and physics, and one of my great heroes was Albert Einstein. So there's this wonderful story told about Albert Einstein. Maybe you've heard this story, but he was giving his lectures on relativity, which is his big contribution to physics. And this was back in the 20s and 30s, and he didn't drive. So the university gave him a driver to drive him around, and the driver would sit in the back listening to his lecture. He was giving the same lecture over and over. And one day, the driver turned to Dr. Einstein and says, "You know, Dr. Einstein, I've heard your lecture so many times, I think I could give it for you." And he said, "Oh, really? Okay." So he got a wig on and sort of dressed up as Einstein. And Einstein sort of put his driver's cap on, sat in the back. And so he comes to this next place. He gives this lecture in front of a faculty of folks. And he does a word-perfect presentation. At the end of the lecture, of course, somebody raises their hand and has a question, right? So he asked this complicated physics question of this driver. The driver thought for a minute and said, "You know, that sounds like a really complicated question, but it's actually really simple. In fact, it's so simple, I'm going to ask my driver to respond for me." So if you have really tough questions, Rob, you're on, so just so you know. Well, it's a real joy to be here with all of you, and I just hope you know how lucky you are to have an organization like Faith Co-op here in Chattanooga. We were comparing notes a little bit, Jonathan and I, earlier, and we had a Fellows-like program in Seattle for a while, and unfortunately, the person who started it moved on, and we've not really had something like this. So you're so lucky to have an organization that will create a space like this for all of you to gather, to learn together, to think, and to wrestle with. What does it mean to take our faith and our work as that vocation is in fact meant to be integral to our work rather than sort of an incidental thing? So, as my friend Steve Garber likes to say. Well, let me start. I'm going to talk sort of about this subject, about wisdom, but I'm going to try to talk about sort of three main things about it. But let me just start. It might be helpful for you to get to know me a little bit better rather than just sort of my starting off telling you some interesting ideas and practices. You know, I remember sitting in a parking lot with my wife Gail, and it was in Seattle. It was a rainy, dreary kind of Seattle kind of day, and we had just had dinner together. And I could tell there was something on Gail's mind that was bothering her, and so we sat in the car sort of for quite a while in silence. And then she turned to me and finally said this: "I can't do this anymore. If something doesn't change, we're not going to make it." By that time, we'd been together 10 years as a couple. Gail and I started dating when we were in university. She was a bright and brilliant artist and interior designer. I was a math and computer science geek, as I mentioned to you earlier. And I came from an immigrant family, and so we took academics really seriously, and I was one of those high-achieving types. But you could tell when Gail and I met because my GPA fell right to the floor that quarter. Right? So, and she and I married as undergrads. She assumed a supporting role, and I started my professional career. But in our own ways, we were really type A-driven people. We had high expectations of ourselves. We had high expectations of each other. We had high expectations of our families. And we were deeply committed to following Jesus. A young family quickly followed for us, and as well as growth and responsibilities, leadership responsibility both at church and at work. At one time, I was juggling being a new manager of a bunch of technologists, being a first-time elder in our Presbyterian church, being a young father of a couple little kids in preschool, and trying to be a loving spouse to boot. On top of that, my company actually sponsored me to do my PhD work in computer science while working full-time. So if that doesn't sound crazy to you, it really was. But maybe you can relate to the story in the sense that all of us in leadership face this demand to basically want to do everything, right? I mean, I don't know if you struggle with that, as I have. We struggle with the expectations that others put on us. We struggle with the expectations we put on ourselves, about our work, about our families, about our church, about our civic engagement. And strangely, our Christian commitments can make it worse, right? Because we want to do great things. We want to contribute to the well-being of the world. And you're here because you're committed to that, right? You're committed to the flourishing of your businesses, the flourishing of your family, the flourishing of your church community, and the flourishing of the city of Chattanooga, right? Which is part of why you're here. But if we don't handle these things well, we find ourselves, as Gail and I did, overwhelmed by expectations, frayed relationships, missed family commitments, and work that never seems to end. In retrospect, I was foolish to take on so many responsibilities all at once, right? But I don't know if you've had this experience, my sense of calling to all these things made it impossible for me to say no to any of them. It was just too easy to say yes. But by God's grace and with Gail's considerable patience, we made some hard decisions and I cut back some of my commitments. Fast forward to today, and I'm glad to tell you that Gail and I are celebrating our 50th anniversary this year. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks be to God, and thanks be to Gail. Right? How do we cultivate? But I think the good news that you can take away from my little story about this is that wisdom can be learned, even if it requires getting some sense knocked into us along the way. And I guess I'm exhibit A in that regard. But how do we cultivate wisdom and in our leadership journey? That's the question I want to explore with you a little bit today at lunch. So I want to talk about three things with you. I want to talk about three themes. Wisdom itself, as Jonathan was saying, is a complex subject. But there are some key themes that help us navigate what does it mean to be wise in a marketplace context as leaders. And there are three things I want to talk about. One, how do we become a servant leader, and what does that mean? How do we become a human leader? And how do we become a communal leader? So let me talk about those three things. I'm going to put up some artwork that I hope is helpful for you. So let's start with something we're pretty familiar with, I suspect, the idea of becoming a servant leader. I suspect most of you in the room want to be servant leaders, right? I think as Christians we know that our vocation is not, in Jesus' words, to lord it over others, right? We're here to serve them instead. And yet by being a leader, by definition, means that you have power over others, right? And whether that power energizes you or makes you a bit squeamish. In my first management role, I became friends with a fellow manager named Pete. And Pete was a bit older, more experienced in managing things, but we compared notes about what does it mean to lead in the way of Jesus as managers. One day Pete startled me by saying, you know, it's not hard to be a leader if you don't mind being a son of a bitch. Pete's memorable words have stuck with me, as you can tell, but it basically reminds me of how hard it is to hold power and humility together, right? In my experience, maybe it's yours too, that humility and power often feel like oil and water, right? You can have one and not the other, but they really don't mix very well. But I think one of my key learnings in my journey has been seeing power and humility really as they're meant to be two sides of the same coin rather than two incompatible things. So what are some helpful insights toward that? To begin with, it's worth noting that Jesus' teaching on humility, like this wonderful piece of art shows Jesus washing Peter's feet, which was one of the major images that he wanted to leave with his disciples, that while he's teaching on humility, it's actually rooted in his authority and power. When Jesus finished washing Peter's feet, he said, "You call me teacher and Lord, and you're right, for that's what I am. So if I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet." In other words, Jesus embodies a radical vision, a radical posture of humility, while at the same time reaffirming his role, his authority and power as Lord and teacher. And that's a challenging thing to hold together. I currently teach at Fuller Seminary, teaching their Doctorate of Global Leadership class, and it's a remarkable group of folks from all around the world. But one of the interesting characteristics of the participants are that there are a lot of, there's considerable diversity in the room. In fact, a number of them are black women who hold senior executive roles in public corporations. And as I was talking about being a leader, a servant leader, I quickly learned that the word servant leader lands differently for them than it did for me as a mostly white male. For them, being servants sounded disturbingly like the cultural message that black women are supposed to serve but not lead. So it's important. That's why this holding humility and power together is so important. It's important to remember that Jesus didn't wash Peter's feet because Jesus was a household servant. It's quite the opposite, right? He's God incarnate and Lord of all, who wielded his power by kneeling to do the work of the lowliest servant for the sake of others. That's what made it so startling. That's why I find historian John Dixon's definition of humility so helpful. I quote this in the book. He defines humility as, quote, "the noble choice to forego your status, deploy your resources, or use your influence for the good of others before yourself." That's how you hold humility and power together. Humility does not mean we have to be doormats for others. Humility does not mean we are milquetoasts, afraid to use our power for justice. Humility means that we have, as human beings made in the image of God, the innate dignity and power to serve others for the common good. So one of the first lessons of becoming wise in this journey of wisdom is to learn how to exercise power and humility together to serve others. The second aspect of that is that while you're doing this, holding this together, remember who your real master is. Jesus calls us to serve others because we are first and foremost his servants. And that insight can be surprisingly helpful. As leaders committed to serving others, we face needs that, left unchecked, seek to master us. In an always-on, interconnected world, everyone's needs stare us in the face 24/7, right? That's my experience. I suspect that's yours too. And I was raised in a family system that taught me to care, which is a wonderful thing for others. In fact, learning to care is one of the great gifts of a Christian vision of being human. But paradoxically, we also need to learn as leaders not to care. That may sound a bit strange and paradoxical. Our wisest spiritual guides tell us that it's important to cultivate a healthy detachment. If we care too much, we risk being overwhelmed and burning out. Remembering that Jesus is our master helps us learn that not everything is our responsibility. Not every need is ours to meet. Not every burden is ours to carry. In the words of the poet T.S. Eliot, who writes, "Teach us to care and not to care." That's been a poetic phrase that's stuck in my mind for quite some time to help me remember we need to care, but there are times when this is not our burden to carry. Otherwise, the needs of others will master us. Learning to discern when to care and when not to care is part of the journey of wisdom, as I said. And that's why Eliot expressed it as a prayer. Wisdom is formed in us as leaders as we learn to pray, "Teach us to care and not to care." And as we learn when and how to care, we discover something else that's surprising. Leaders have to learn to pay attention to the periphery of their leadership vision. What do I mean by that? As leaders, we naturally focus on people who are most important to our work, right? As I'm a board chair of a large regional health system, I spend a lot of time with my CEO, my board colleagues, and the senior executive team. And that's good. That's essential for me to be able to do the work of being board chair. But one of the radical challenges of the Christian vision of leadership is that we must also pay attention to those on the periphery. We need to focus not only on those we consider important and influential to our work, but also on those who are on the margins. One way I do this is by regularly visiting our frontline workers, something we call rounding in healthcare. Our managers do it, our executives do it, and as board chair, I need to do it. It's a chance to see and learn things firsthand, and it's a great way to honor those who are doing the hard work and often unrecognized work of caring for our patients. As leaders, we naturally focus on what we deem most important. Becoming wise requires to pay attention not only to the center of our vision, but to the periphery of our vision. So seeing power and humility as two sides of the same coin, learning to care and not to care, and paying attention to the periphery of our leadership vision are all helpful practices in learning to become a wise servant leader. The second theme I want to talk about is learning to embrace a human rather than a superhuman model of leadership. One of the most astonishing claims, as you know, of the Christian faith is that God became a human being, right? The creator of the heavens and the earth, all things visible and invisible, took on the limitations of being human. In some ways, Jesus' humanity is more difficult for us to grasp than his divinity. Often we think of him like Superman, actually, right? He may look like Clark Kent, he may act like Clark Kent, but we know he's really Superman. Jesus may look human, he may even act human. Well, we know he's really God incarnate, right? So maybe he's not really human like me or you. But as hard as it is to fathom, the truth about Jesus' full humanity can form us to become wise leaders. And here's why. If Jesus accepted the limitations of being human, so should we as leaders. Wise leaders are not superheroes. And that's a very countercultural thing in our current North American and American culture, both in the church and outside the church. I think we tend to hold the view that leaders should be somehow almost superheroic in their work. To put it in more familiar biblical language, wise leaders don't strive to become, quote, like God. Rather, wise leaders recognize their humanity and embrace their finiteness. As someone once said, Riley, there is a God, but you're not it, right? As a tech entrepreneur, I know the long hours and hard work it takes to start a new business. I've also seen the positive effects of that business on the local community and on people and folks both locally and nationally. But success, and here's the thing, whether in business, in church, or in nonprofits, can create the illusion that we're godlike, that we can or should work nonstop. That is particularly true in entrepreneurial settings like mine. As Harvard historian Eric Baker recently wrote in the New York Times, American business culture equates incessant work with entrepreneurial success. So as Christians, we are actually taking a countercultural view of this. Because ironically, we moderns have made a virtue out of working 24/7, right? They used to do that in the old days, in Egypt, and they called it slavery, right? We defer or interrupt our vacations. We work late into the night and on weekends. You can ask Gail because I've done all those things, right? So when God's people worked like this in ancient times, they didn't celebrate it. They called it slavery. And God set them free and granted them rhythms of rest that we are also meant to enjoy. Becoming wise means recognizing the gift of being finite creatures, not least by containing our compulsion for ceaseless work. Another aspect of becoming a human leader rather than a superhero is our willingness to be vulnerable. In the creation narrative, we're told that God created human beings to exercise power and responsibility, right? Genesis 1:26, what Genesis calls dominion on God's behalf. At the same time, God created human beings and describes their creation as beings who are naked and not ashamed. Andy Crouch makes this wonderful observation that in God's design, vulnerability and dignity are not opposed to one another, and neither are dependence and dominion. It's really interesting to hold those two things together. As leaders, we want to appear powerful and invulnerable. Showing weakness risks others taking advantage. That's what we think, and that can be true. Showing weakness might undermine our credibility in the eyes of those we are called to serve. And yet vulnerability is worth the risk. After 9/11, decades ago, our software company was faced with making some dramatic cuts. For some time, I wasn't sure how many or how big it needed to be, like many other businesses. So I struggled with what to tell my team and what to tell them and how much that they should know. And I felt a bit vulnerable given the uncertainties and the risk of losing my team's confidence in me as their leader. Ultimately, I opted to share with my team that what we were facing despite the uncertainties and risks. I told them what I knew and what I didn't know. And I asked two things of them. One, to stay focused on their work so we didn't make things worse. And two, to let me know if they had intentions that would have affected our staffing. And I was really surprised by their response. Several offered to reduce their work to part-time so others could stay. One person said they were planning on relocating. I suspect my willingness to be vulnerable with them gave them permission to do the same with me. I have to admit that being vulnerable can occasionally bring out the worst in people. I've had that experience. I'm sure you have too. So we shouldn't do it naively. We need to understand the context. And I knew my team well enough to know that they could reasonably deal with this. However, acknowledging our human vulnerability can also bring out the best in people. And even with the risk, isn't that what leaders like us should be doing? In addition to learning to accept our limitations, learning to be vulnerable is a critical aspect of becoming a truly human leader. The last thing I want to say about shifting from a superhero model to a genuinely human model of leadership is that there are some spiritual practices that can help us along the way. I call them, quote, the practices of finitude, of being finite. In other ways, they remind us that God is God and we're not. And surprisingly, one of the simplest of these spiritual practices, not the easiest, but the simplest, is sleep. I suspect most of you don't think of sleep as a spiritual discipline or a practice. After all, sleep's a biological necessity, right? We all have to sleep at some point. So how can it be an intentional practice? Now the CDC, you've probably heard some of this data, the CDC suggests there's 1 in 3 people in the US is not getting enough sleep. I suspect the percentage is higher in this room given the people we are in terms of trying to accomplish things in life, right? But the demands of modern life, overlaid with the expectations of our Christian convictions, set us up to view sleep as an annoyance to minimize as best as we can. We try to cram more and more into a 24-hour day, and that means we sleep less and less. In contrast, wisdom suggests that sleep is meant to be a gift of God. Our daily need for sleep is actually an opportunity for us to acknowledge our limits and to acknowledge His sovereignty. We are reminded each night that we can't be, quote, like God after all. After all, we have to fall asleep, and God doesn't sleep. But we can, with the psalmist, learn to say, I lie down and sleep, I wake again, for the Lord sustains me. Every night, we're given the opportunity to experience sleep as an act of faith. I don't know if you've ever thought about it that way. Our faith in God rather than a faith in ourselves. Wherever we are with our projects, our to-do lists, we are invited to, quote, cast all our cares on Him, for He cares for you. Right? It's a surprisingly simple and yet difficult thing to do when deadlines and crises stare us in the face. You know, I'm technically retired now, but I still struggle with going to sleep. You know, there are things I'm doing. I'm getting ready to come to see you all and prepare what I'm going to say. It's easy just to let that dominate our lives rather than stopping and acknowledging it's enough for one day. That's why it's a spiritual discipline. Being wise requires not only hard work, which it does, and perseverance, which it does, but a willingness each day to stop our work and go to sleep as an act of faith. In other words, learning to be wise requires a willingness to let go and allow God to be God. So let me get to my last thing I want to show you. And I think this is probably the most countercultural one of all the three of them that I'm talking about with you today. And that's moving from a solitary practice of leadership to one that sees leadership as a communal art. Some time ago, I had a good friend who was a CEO of a large national Fortune 500 company. He was widely known as a Christian, fine Christian example, practiced, had a wonderful reputation, and we became friends in part because I wanted to learn from him. So he became a mentor. We spent a lot of time together talking about different things, and at one point, as we talked more and more and got to know each other better, he became more and more vulnerable with me. And then one day we were talking about this was before my experience as a CEO. I said, so what's it like to be a CEO, really? And he said, candidly, he found it a solitary, even lonely experience. And then he said, with tears in his eyes, he said, and I know I made it that way. I understood what he meant. Our culture celebrates an individualistic, even heroic practice of leadership, especially in some Christian circles. I felt sad for my friend because of his sense of isolation, that he had internalized something that he thought was wise and biblical that actually was not. Because in fact, it's the opposite of biblical wisdom. The good news is that leadership was never meant to be a solitary practice. It was always meant to be practiced in community. And that's not always easy to do when you're a CEO. And so you have to be wise about how to do that. We can talk about it maybe a little bit more if others want to ask some questions around it. And that means, I think, fundamentally that we have to view leadership as a team sport rather than an individual one. I think that imagery has been helpful to me. It's thinking, rather than being this individual player, I'm actually working in some kind of team context. Helps me understand my work better. As a result of my conversation with my friend, I've spent much of my life cultivating my leadership ecosystem. I've worked hard to build relationships in many and varied leadership contexts. Perhaps the most compelling argument for wisdom being found in such a diverse community biblically is the day of Pentecost, and that's the picture you see here. The dove falling and with the tongues of fire. It's probably a little hard to see, but there are individual tongues of fire on every person, okay? On that day, God's Spirit and wisdom were given to the whole community and not just to a special group or to a privileged class. It didn't just fall on the apostles, it didn't just fall on the men, it fell on everybody who was there. As the Apostle Peter acknowledged, God's Spirit is given to all, even those who were considered weak or of lesser value in their culture. The experience of the day of Pentecost echoes my earlier comments about paying attention to the folks who are on the margins, because God gives the Spirit to the folks on the margins as well. The Apostle Paul says this even more passionately and explicitly. On the contrary, the members of the body that seem to be weaker are indispensable. God has so arranged the body, giving the greater honor to the inferior member. To heed this biblical wisdom, we need to cultivate a community of diverse voices in our leadership circle. Frankly, for me at least, it's easy to build teams and attract people who are similar to us. We were talking about that this morning, Jonathan. I'm an idea guy, so I tend to get people around me who are idea people. Actually, we were just chatting that one of the managers that I finally brought into the circle was very much a concrete, sequential, get it done kind of person. We were having all these conversations about all these ideas, and she at one point stopped us and said, "No more ideas, let's just do something." Right? I don't know if you're an idea person or doing more focused on action. I think it's good to have different perspectives at the table, right? And so it's harder to attract those kind of people. And I found, frankly, I think much of my leadership journey, I was looking for people who were more like me than who were different from me. And it's even harder to create a hospitable space for those different from us to contribute meaningfully. In my board work, I do a lot of board governance work in this season of my life. I've often found that women directors were less verbal than men in board conversations. So I asked one of my experienced women board colleagues to help me understand why. And she was somebody who served in some major boards and was a woman in often a male context. She shared her decades-long experience where male board members regularly talked over their female counterparts, making it difficult for them to get a word in edgewise. And she said many male directors affirmed their male counterparts, but not their female ones, even when both said the same thing. And I have to admit, in a moment of true confession, as I thought about how I acted in board meetings, I don't know why, I sort of did some of that too. And it's just a cultural thing that I had adopted, and it was a blind spot for me in my leadership practice. So her advice to me was simple. If you want my advice, ask me, and if you agree with me, say so. Her feedback helped change the way I conduct board meetings. I instituted a practice at the end of each meeting of going around the table, asking each person for their comments and questions. That's one way, it's a very simple and small way, where everyone can be heard from, and not just those of us who happen to be alpha males. I also work at being more intentional about affirming my female board colleagues when they make a point I agree with. The experience taught me something more generally important, that leaders have the responsibility not only to create space for those at the table, for those who haven't had space, haven't had a seat at the table, but we have a responsibility to change the culture of the table to make it more hospitable to others. And that's hard work. Otherwise, we'll miss out on all of the wisdom God has to offer in our work by excluding those who have something to say and to contribute. As wise leaders, we need to learn how to intentionally change our leadership culture to make it hospitable to those who are different from us. So, given all that, I've said these things to you. Well, how might you begin? Try to make it more directly practical. So here are 3 ideas, and I hope you'll try one of 2 or 3 of them that I would encourage you to try. One is make a list of people you work with who are in the periphery of your leadership vision. In other words, not those you would naturally focus on or spend time with. Pick one person from that list and connect with them. You don't need to have an agenda. Just show up and let them know that you care about them and their work. 2, another simple practice idea is each evening take a few minutes to consciously let go of your work to God. Give thanks to God for your day and just simply acknowledge that God is God and you are not. I've done this a number of times. And each time I'm surprised by how surprising it is that I seem to think that I'm God and God is not, even though I obviously should know better. And the 3rd idea is find someone outside of your existing leadership circle and sit down with them over coffee or lunch. Get to know them and see whether you'd like to continue the relationship further. This is part of building a wider leadership ecosystem that you interact with. Taking any one of those small steps will not only begin to shape your own leadership, it will positively affect your organization, your city, and our world. A world that increasingly desperately needs wise leaders who embody genuine hope and trustworthiness. And the truth is, none of us can do that alone. We can only do that as a faithful community of leaders who learn to trust God and to trust one another. Your being here is an opportunity to cultivate such an ecosystem of leaders in the city of Chattanooga who are committed to doing business for the common good. So remember that God does not expect you to neglect your power as a servant leader. Instead, God wants you to embody power with humility in the service of the weak and the vulnerable. But remember, God doesn't expect you to be a superhero either. Instead, God wants you to be a human leader with all the gifts and the limitations that implies. And remember that God does not expect you to feel isolated and alone as a leader. Instead, God wants you to flourish as part of a diverse leadership community. As the Apostle Paul wrote to the early church, we are God's handiwork. We are God's handiwork, not just you and me individually, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do. May that be true for all of you who seek to be wise servants in this generation, for the glory of God and for the common good of the city of Chattanooga. Amen. Love to.